You are listening to Build Europe, the podcast of the Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung European Union. In case you're joining us for the first time, we are the German Green Political Foundation affiliated with the German political party Allianz 90, the Greens. Our EU office represents the foundation vis-à-vis European and international institutions, associations, non-governmental organizations, and media based in Brussels. Today on the Build Europe podcast, we discuss the role of healthy soils for climate mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity, and food production.
Wow.
That's nice earth here, huh?
Yeah, the topsoil looks great. It's really great.
Well, we got like 20 centimeters?
Yeah,
What would you say?
20 to 24.
Not too much of a humus, yeah?
No, not really.
Do you have a connection to soil? What associations do you have when we talk about soil and earth?
My first very close experience with soil is probably a similar one than for many others. It's when I created my first garden bed. I was younger. I just took the shovel and I turned the soil for days, and it was a real struggle. So it was not a very nice experience. But then I joined a community garden. And for the first time, I learned that we should actually take care of soil, that we should leave an organic layer, that we should feed soil organisms, and that we should also give something in return. And this experience gave me a completely different understanding of what soil actually is.
Carolina Heinzel works at the European Environmental Bureau in Brussels, Europe's largest network of environmental citizens organizations, with more than 185 member organizations in more than 40 countries.
And it's true that soils are poorly researched and that there are so many tiny and invisible organisms that we don't even see. But for me, soil is also extremely, well, we can really grasp it, we can touch it, we can see it, and we can also see when soil is not well. So for me personally, soil is definitely still a mystery and fascinating.
Heinzel cherishes this personal connection, like when she's holding topsoil in her hand or digging up beds or planting new ones. The soil expert is always trying to ground herself, as she says, an experience that helps her to navigate Europe's complex environmental policy.
I focus on European soil policy in my work.
Because soil policy is controlled by so many special interests that it's easy to forget what it's actually about.
What soil means for me here in Brussels is also soil is extremely political. So soil is contested. It has to fulfill so many different purposes. It has to provide space for infrastructure. It has to be productive. Often it's also linked to private property.
She thinks for a moment and adds,
in all these political debates here in Brussels, I sometimes wish that we should not forget that soils are also life and they are our basis for life.
Soil, Gone in the Wind. Soil Atlas Part 3, a podcast by Peter Kreisler.
We haven't yet understood exactly how we can better preserve our fertile and healthy soils and secure them for the future.
How can we rebuild the topsoil layer that has been lost through erosion? Also so that our children and grandchildren can enjoy good harvests, so that potatoes, legumes, or the rye for our bread continue to thrive.
Soil degradation is a serious problem.
Fertile soil, like air and water, is a basic element of human life. It's absolutely essential for our existence. What can we do to ensure that our soils remain healthy in the future?
This is the subject of the third and final episode of our podcast series, Soil Atlas 2024. To start with, we want to try and understand where we stand in regard to soil. To help me get an overview, I meet an expert on agriculture and soil in Berlin.
My name is Inka Dewitz. I am an agriculture engineer and a senior program officer here at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation.
So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the challenges we're facing. What are the trends when it comes to soil?
Yes, first of all, the soil are the basis of our life, and not only for us humans, but also for plants, for animals, for microorganisms. And there could be billions or tens of billions of microorganisms in a single gram of soil. And these microbes play a crucial role in nutrient cycling, organic matter decomposition, and supporting plant health. But that's not all. Soils provide indispensable ecosystem functions and services. Healthy soils, for instance, filter groundwater, they regulate the nutrient, carbon and pollutant cycle and serve as habitat for animals, plants and microorganisms, and therefore they're very important for preserving biodiversity.
So maybe you can give us some numbers. How much CO2 can be stored in healthy soil?
One very important function of soils is that they can store huge amounts of carbon, and of course it depends on the soil type. For instance, peatlands or peat soils, they are by far the soils that can store the most carbon. In numbers, this would mean healthy soils worldwide. They can store about 680 billion tons of carbon in the first or the top 30 centimeters. And as I mentioned, the peat soils are like very important soils in the sense of carbon storage. Although they only cover 3% of the Earth's land surface, they can store twice as much carbon as than in the biomass of all the world's forests combined.
But that's not all. In times of regular heavy rainfall events, peat soils have an additional, very important regulating role.
Peatlands have a very important function. They can store huge amounts of water as well, and they can release it in times of droughts. And of course, they have this potential to store carbon in these huge amounts. So peatlands are very important soils for climate protection, but they're also in danger. They are drained for agriculture use and they're destroyed worldwide. And if peat soils are destroyed, they release large amounts of CO2 into the atmosphere, and therefore the function is reversed and they damage the climate.
If peatlands can store such vast amounts of precipitation, then their conservation and restoration is all the more essential. This is how peatlands can help us combat flood disasters and promote climate protection. But unfortunately, we're in the process of losing these important soils and humus layers that have the potential to not only absorb CO2, but also to drain large amounts of water. The intensive use of fertilizers and pesticides causes long-term damage to soils, and the use of increasingly heavy machinery leads to soils becoming increasingly compacted, as Davids warns.
Well, yeah, it is very important that we protect our soils and that we preserve their functions. Soils, they are under severe threat worldwide, not just here in Europe, but all over the world. And this threat is partly due to human activity, but also due to the effects of climate change, like, for instance, extreme weathers, droughts, heavy rain, wind, all these causing problems for soils worldwide.
But here too, don't humans and their impact on the soil play an important role?
Let me give you some examples for threats by human activity. Like, in particular, the sealing of soils for housing and transportation destroys soil's structure. Soil can then no longer breathe, it's covered by concrete. And also unsustainable agriculture or forestry plays a major role. One facet of the problem is the intensity of farming on fertile soils, like generally characterized by narrow crop rotation, by large fields, monoculture, a lack of semi-natural landscape features like hedges or trees, and also the intensive use of plant protection, pesticides, products and fertilizers, and high grazing intensities, meaning too many animals on a small area of land. All these damage the soil and the soil life, and therefore also the function of the soil is decreased.
I reached Carolina Heinzel in Brussels via video call. European elections have just taken place, and they've resulted in more complicated majorities in the European Parliament. Majorities that will make it more difficult to find good solutions to pressing environmental issues that we'll be facing in the next 5 years. How is the soil situation? How fast are we losing this very important raw material?
Well, our soils in the EU are in a really, really bad shape. It is estimated, because we don't yet have very clear numbers, but it is estimated that 60 to 70% of our soils are in poor condition. And those are numbers for the EU, but if we look globally, we can expect that up to 90% of our soils could be in poor condition by 2050 if we continue as we do with business as usual.
The soils on which we grow our food are becoming an increasingly scarce resource. By the year 2050, up to 90% of the world's land could be in poor condition, a figure that all of us should be worried about. Not only is farmland being lost to road building and settlements, but the topsoil layer in the fields is also dwindling, as we heard in Part 1. Soil erosion is also increasing. Stronger winds or floods are carrying away loose topsoil, which happens increasingly when soils dry out, partly because the climate is getting hotter and summers are getting drier. Soil fertility suffers when our soils stop being healthy. Depleted soils do not produce good harvests in the long term. But perhaps we can't reclaim the lost soil.
There's not a technology that can replace soils. So soil is a non-renewable resource, which means that it takes about 1,000 years for the soil ecosystem to produce just 1 centimeter of topsoil. And if soil erodes, it is just gone.
1,000 years is a very long time. This is why Carolina Heinzel is so concerned about the issue of soil health. She sees it as a creeping, silent crisis that most people are not yet sufficiently aware of, despite the repeated warnings, such as from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. The organization fears that we might only have 60 successful harvests left before fields become too barren to feed the planet. So it's high time for a change of course.
There definitely needs to be more awareness here, but I definitely think that politics have to create the framework to recognize the critical situation of soil, to recognize this, to have the sense of urgency. And food security is a very good example here because, of course, soil produces our food. So erosion alone causes over 1 billion euros in losses in agricultural production per year. This is an enormous amount of loss. And at the same time, we also have climate change, where increasing extreme weather events create really difficult situation for farmers and for food production in the end.
But what are the solutions? So far, scientific experiments to accelerate generating topsoil on a large scale have failed.
So healthy soils and the appropriate soil management are also extremely important and an extremely important buffer for making food production more resilient. And I think linking these two together also in the public awareness, but also with the sense of urgency that we need in the policy area is extremely important because, of course, it's very clear. Without healthy soils, we do not have any food.
So it looks like a really escalating situation.
Absolutely. And I think even this relates very much to this link to climate change, because this link is extremely complex. Because on the one hand, climate change is damaging our soils, but at the same time, soils are extremely important allies in climate change, to combat climate change, because they are such an important carbon sink. And then the third facet of this is that we need healthy soils to be able to deal with these extreme weather events that are becoming more likely with climate change. So it's an incredibly complex situation, or interlinkages with climate change, especially as you said.
So what would be a better way of doing this?
If, for example, we have cover crops, the soil dries out less quickly during droughts. And at the same time, if we have living roots in the soil, then the soil can retain nutrients or stabilize the soil itself during heavy rainfall. So it's actually really a cycle.
Where does Carolina see the responsibility of politics or the possibilities to erect safeguards here so that the trend of soil degradation can be reversed?
I think in general, soil has to be seen here more as one element in the broader food system, because of course the agricultural sector is heavily subsidized.
So far, most of the EU budget goes to agriculture via the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP for short, which pays out billions in agricultural subsidies to farmers. It also plays a key role in deciding how agriculture is organized in the EU. But more and more people in Europe are demanding that the flat rate area payments be cancelled completely, and that farmers only be paid for measures that have societal benefits, such as environmental protection. Public money for public services. That's been the catchy slogan for many years. The so-called eco-schemes that have been in place until now are very limited in their effectiveness, and some of the achievements in the areas of environmental and soil protection were immediately eradicated in the wake of the Russian attack on Ukraine and the Europe-wide farmers' protests that began at the end of 2023. Is there an obligation to leave part of the land fallow or to plant hedges? What is the minimum number of crop rotations that farms must plan for? Will the cultivation of legumes such as lentils, beans, and lupins be subsidized? These crops have major benefits for the soil because, among other things, they can fix nitrogen in the soil and therefore improve soil health and fertility. All of this could also help soil health. Caroline Heinzel sees the CAP as an effective lever for doing something about the issue of soil because
it's very crucial that this funding goes in the right direction. This means that small and medium-sized farms need also to be supported to produce healthy food, sustainably, ecologically, and in a resilient way for everyone.
But the reality for small farms in Europe is looking increasingly bleak. Even though most farms in the EU are still small, the imbalance is particularly evident in crop yields.
And this also means, of course, to apply sustainable soil management practices. So, in general, most farms in the EU are quite small. In 2020, almost 2/3 of farms were less than 5 hectares in size. And at the same time, only about 3% of farms produce half of the agricultural output in the EU. So this shows quite a clear concentration of power. And this is also very visible when we look at the Common Agricultural Policy, which plays a very significant role here as well, where only 20% of farmers receive 80% of direct payments.
the increasing concentration of farms is a truly worrisome trend that is further damaging soil health. Highly mechanized agriculture is increasingly creating monocultures, while significant crop rotation is disappearing. The use of heavy machinery further compacts the soil. Caroline believes that we can only do more for soil health by changing the system. In other words, an agricultural turnaround. But there's another facet that we must not lose sight of, according to Caroline.
When we talk about the social element as well, which concerns, of course, the price of food, but also the costs for those who produce it and their livelihoods, it's really important to look at the entire food system. So, and to look at the agribusinesses, the big agribusinesses that are the main beneficiaries, to look at the pressure on prices also for small farmers, and also to consider that 70% of EU agricultural land is used to grow feed for animals and not food for people. So in the end, we need a fair and resilient food system where farmers are supported to produce healthy food in an ecological manner and are well paid for that, and at the same time making it accessible to everyone. So soils are a crucial part of this entire system.
Yes, my name is Jutta Paulus. I'm a member of European Parliament from the Green Party Germany, and I'm sitting on the Committee for Environment, Public Health, and a lot of other things. Of course, soil is one of the very, very relevant issues when it comes to our environment and also to our food safety.
This is Jutta Paulus. I reach her in her district electoral office in southwestern Germany. As a member of the European Parliament, Paulus actively shapes agricultural policy in Europe. What is the status of soil in Europe, I ask her.
60% of the soils in the European Union is in a poor state, more or less degraded, and the trend is going downwards. So we have more degradation of soils, partly due to climate change, of course, because especially in southern and eastern Europe, we have a serious issue with droughts, with missing water, with missing moisture for soils. But it's also an issue of too intensive agriculture, which destroys the health of the soil, be it because too much manure or too much synthetic fertilizer is put in, be it because of too many pesticides, which do not only affect the plants and the insects, but also the microbiome of the soil, which is desperately needed to keep the soil healthy and to keep alive the ecosystem services that soil is giving us.
At least Brussels has now set out to address the issue. The issue of soils has been recognized, but whether more effective measures will follow is uncertain. The problem is still being described instead of being tackled.
We had, let's say, it's a mixed picture when it comes to European soils. We have seen the report from the European Environment Agency, which came out in the course of developing the soil health monitoring law. It was supposed to be a soil health law. Now it's only a soil health monitoring law, which is, of course, not a very good direction which it is taking, because it was, as I said, meant to be a law to ensure soil health. And now we're just more or less monitoring how soil health degrades, because that's what the report from the European Environment Agency is telling us.
But why is this? Even though the situation of our soil is very critical and everyone recognizes it.
The overall trend is not good, but unfortunately the member states were not willing to have a soil health law. They said, well, why should we do this on the European level? The soil is national and we can do everything we need on the national level. So the EU should best keep away from the issue in the first place.
When it comes to agriculture, the EU member states are very much focused on their own interests. The own nation takes precedent and is favored over the idea of a common Europe. But environmental problems are growing, and it's becoming ever clearer that they can only be solved within a European framework. The European parliamentarian gives an example.
The LULUCF sector, so-called LULUCF sector, means land use change and forestry, is the third pillar when it comes to reducing our emissions. The first pillar is the emission trading system for industry and energy. The second pillar is the effort sharing regulation for buildings, transport, everything else, I might say. And the third is land use change, which is agriculture, which is forestry, which is nature protection, everything that our ecosystems are doing. And there we cannot simply ignore the important role that soil is playing there as carbon sink.
But where are the concrete approaches to protecting soil Europe-wide? We still seem to be stuck in damage analysis mode. Has Europe lost its ambition when it comes to soil health?
Another angle which we could build on, and I think it's quite a good sign what we saw on the strategic dialogue on the future of European agriculture.
The strategic dialogue is a cross-sectoral platform where all stakeholders sit around the same table to find joint solutions. So the significance of this body should not be underestimated.
That was a strategic dialogue that was launched by the Commission, also partly in reaction to the protests of the farmers all over Europe in the last year. And the strategic dialogue brought together actors which are, let's say, not necessarily always of the same opinion. So you had Copa-Cogeca, which is the biggest farmers' lobby in Europe. You had several associations from the food sector. You had several associations from the environmental sector, NGOs. You had scientists. So it was a very diverse group that was sitting and discussing for month and month and month. And at the end of the day produced a report of several hundred pages, which was endorsed and signed by all those political groups, all of them. And this is really, really important in my personal view, because any MEP which would be working on the next legislation for the common agricultural policy couldn't say, well, I support the farmers and therefore I'm against this or that, because then you can always come out, hey, this is the report, these are the recommendations, it was signed by the farmers' lobby, please explain why you will now not endorse it.
The recent floods in Austria, Spain, Germany, and Poland have fueled discussion about what can be changed preventatively to prepare for future heavy rainfall events. Discussions, however, tend to revolve around raising dikes or building flood retention basins. In other words, protective measures focused on when the rivers have already burst their banks. The storage capacities of soils, by contrast, could be improved through changes in agriculture. However, farmers would also have to be incentivized to do this. The CAP offers interesting opportunities here, and Paulus explains how such soil improvement could also be implemented at administrative level and with high tech.
For example, if you had an instrument in the Common Agricultural Policy which says we reward the farmers that treat their soil well and improve the water capacity of the soil. This could be a very relevant issue also for the farmers who get money. It would be very easy to monitor because the water holding capacity is something which you can derive from satellite data. So the farmer wouldn't even have to do something because the Copernicus satellites, it's open source data, it belongs to the EU, they're flying over anyway. So you just have to look at the pictures, okay, what about the water content? And that could actually reward those that treat their soils well and at the same time make our agricultural system more resilient.
The use of artificial fertilizer can already be significantly reduced today by integrating human waste into the circular economy without any fundamental restructuring of nutrition or agriculture. This is because human waste contains nutrients that can be recycled as fertilizer to encourage plant growth. If correctly prepared and quality controlled, up to 25% of synthetic or mineral fertilizers in Germany could be replaced. Combined with an agricultural transition involving the reduction of livestock farming and plant cultivation for fodder, even less artificial fertilizer would be necessary. Approximately 70 years ago, rural areas in Germany were still fertilized using human waste. Since then, flush toilets, waterborne sewage systems, and wastewater treatment plants have been established, even in the remotest regions of Germany and Europe, leading to important improvements to hygiene.
Yeah, my name is Ariane Krause. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Vegetable and Ornamental Crops in Großbeeren, so I'm based in Brandenburg in the north of Germany.
Maybe you can tell us a bit more about this approach.
Yeah, so the approach of our project, I was the coordinator of the project Zirkulierbar, which is set up a living lab in Brandenburg to produce recycled fertilizers from human excreta. So the idea is to bring our poop back into the loop, so to say, or to capture the nutrients contained in human excreta and to produce recycled fertilizers out of them. Or it's like a both traditional and innovative approach of a circular economy. The production of artificial fertilizers is for various reasons problematic because we use scarce resources, we need a lot of energy, and we have linear material flows. So we harvest the nutrients on the one side and we get rid of them or dispose them mainly in the rivers and water bodies at the end of life. And these nutrients are mainly nitrogen. This is like the nutrient that plants need most, the largest amount of to grow. But it's also phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and so on. So these are the elements that are contained in fertilizers. These are the elements that plants need to grow. And these are also then the elements that are contained in our food that we consume and that also leave our body with our human excreta.
Studies in Germany show that it would be really worthwhile because the wastewater that simply flows into the sewer system contains valuable minerals that could be very useful for agriculture. The approach of processing feces to produce fertilizer, would therefore be worthwhile.
And if we have a look like where we found the biggest amounts of phosphorus to recycle them, it's in wastewater. And then if we go deeper to look inside this, then we realize that the largest part stems from human excreta. So, for example, human urine is only 1 volume% of wastewater, but it contributes more than half of the phosphorus contained in wastewater and about 80 or 90% of the nitrogen. And what we do now, or our approach in Zirkulierbar, but also in comparable projects on the EU level, like the project P2 Green, we want to capture all these nutrients, not only phosphorus, but also nitrogen and potassium and all the nutrients that plants need and that are contained in our excreta.
A high proportion of nutrients in our wastewater comes from human excreta. Urine, for example, comprises less than 1% of the entire wastewater volume, but contributes 70 to 80% of the nitrogen and 45 to 60% of the phosphate found in wastewater. Despite highly technically equipped wastewater treatment, to date, these nutrients are rarely recycled from wastewater, instead leaking into our waterways. There they contribute to the overabundance of nutrients, leading to eutrophication and putting ecosystem diversity at risk.
By now, many farmers have experienced the sheer force with which heavy rainfall events can destroy their fields. It would now make sense to strengthen soil health so that the topsoil can absorb and store more water in the future. In Ghana, we find an example of how difficult and at the same time crucial it is to promote soil health. Audrey Estarco founded the Sabon Saka project, which produces biochar on a large scale in Africa.
On the continent of Africa, we have 60% of the world's available arable land. However, you find a lot of soil degradation going on. Over 65% of soils across sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, are degraded. And that looks at loss of soil carbon down to the impact of soil erosion, nutrient loss. This, I would say, has been exacerbated by a booming population down to the impact of climate change, which has made our soils lose its fertility over time. There's a lot of highly acidic soils across the continent, and it's estimated that, we have up to about 20% of soils, agricultural soils, being highly acidic. So across board, I'd say that farmers are really struggling not just with the impact of change in climate, but as well struggling with growing food that is nutrient dense and improving yields generally. With climate shocks from drought, desertification, to even human-induced degradation, the time is now for us to look at how we can work with nature to improve our soil health, create a more living ecosystem, which is what our soils are, so that they can function at optimum best.
But there are solutions that can improve soil health, as she impressively demonstrates in her project. Here in Africa, she says, this knowledge already exists, and her project is not the only one that produces natural fertilizers and compost.
We over time have been operating in a very linear approach in how we actually grow our food. But if you go back into time, where there was no access to, in quotes, synthetic fertilizer, etc., but we're still able to improve our yields and grow food sustainably, we could see that we approached food production in a more circular way, trying to ensure that we would integrate sustainable practices such as crop rotation, etc., to grow food that is healthy, nutrient dense, and are able to be resilient ecologically. But the point is that if we can tap into what people would term as waste, see that as a resource, and then take it back into the soil, right, which is good organic matter for soil microbes. It would help us, build back our soil capital and ensure that we can actually grow food if there's access to fertilizer or not.
Audrey Darko's startup, Sabonsake, uses agricultural waste to create microbe-enriched biochar that can regenerate infertile and degraded farm soil. The soil amendment is produced with agricultural waste from sugarcane. Sabonsake uses thermochemical conversion technology to produce biochar, which is inoculated with microorganisms and used as a customized blend. This helps sequester carbon, which would otherwise be released into the atmosphere.
Okay, so currently we are adopting and have adopted a model that looks at ensuring that biomass waste generating communities, right, that are churning out tons of abundant biomass waste, such as rice husks, sugarcane bagasse, cocoa pods, coconut shells, down to even fellings from forest zones, etc., that people don't find any use for.
So they simply collect waste lying around on the farms and turn it into biochar. Can Audrey give us an example of the scale to which this is occurring in Ghana?
We have a network of over 7,000 farmers that are aware of how to produce biochar, right, have tapped into its application and use and have seen firsthand the benefits to their land, right? And it's working. It's working for them, and they can see the successes on their land, on their yields, on the resilience of their crops. And what we do to kind of reel them more in is to ensure that they can dedicate portions of their land solely focusing on regenerative practices, right? And that have been the way to kind of make them ambassadors for turning waste into organic soil amendments and adopting regenerative practices. So once we're able to let them use half an acre, just applying regenerative practices, and they've got to see firsthand how it's turning in revenue and good yields for them, they start to have a good buy-in for that project. So that's been our approach so far.
But as we heard in part 1 of our podcast series, Africa's politicians are trying to supply the depleted soils with artificial fertilizer. The artificial fertilizer industry is trying to make inroads onto the continent as a new market opportunity. I want to hear from Audrey what she thinks of the efforts to improve Africa's soils using artificial fertilizers.
We need to be very honest with ourselves as a continent, as a people. You have huge risks, such as biodiversity loss. You have huge risks, such as land pollution. You have huge risks of leaching. You have huge risks of high acidity in our soils, right? And then you have huge risks around how we're able to build our seed diversity, right? And I would say that this really, over time, has made us more susceptible to soil erosion, nutrient depletion, and generally also affected our well-being and our health generally. And what I would like to add on and say is this: we probably need to start listening to the land more, right? And asking ourselves if these fertilizers are, one, not increasing organic matter or carbon into the soil, if they're not accelerating microbial activity, if they're not helping to address climate justice, and if they're not working with nature, right, to help improve our land, our yields, the soil health, then it would mean that we'll need to start redefining what we'll term as good fertilizer, or how do we define fertilizer in general. And yes, it's imperative that, on a continent that is suffering from soil degradation, etc., that we need to have fertilizer to help boost or accelerate our yields. But definitely not the ones that make us lack in terms of nutrients over time, in terms of microbial activity, and just give us short-term gains.
While in Africa, the African Union is pushing for the use of artificial fertilizers, in Europe there have been setbacks in the environmental measures under the CAP. The CAP is probably the most effective steering tool that can be used to turn agriculture around, primarily because there is so much money involved. In total, we're talking about nearly 400 billion euros.
Well, the Common Agricultural Policy is responsible for about a third of the European budget. So it's one of the biggest budget lines that we have in our multi-annual financial framework. And of course, also for many farmers, it's a very relevant part of their income. So via the Common Agricultural Policy, you really steer in which direction farming is going and how farming is being done. And unfortunately, in the direction in the last years has always been more yield, more intensive farming. Then in the last CAP, we had those eco schemes, right? So where farmers were supposed to be rewarded for doing more ecological measures. Yeah, but unfortunately, after the farmers' protests, all conditionalities, so everything that farmers had to do in order to receive their direct payments, like planting cover crops, like having crop rotation and all this, it was all scrapped, right? So now we're back to 2001 in terms of ecological compliance of Common Agricultural Policy money, which is not a good development. Right now, it was more like, okay, you got a lot of acres, you get a lot of money, which was not necessarily what would actually help the respective farmer, but actually would more or less be a money printing machine for the very big agricultural companies.
Nevertheless, Paulus sees opportunities to make progress for soil health via the CAP in the next legislative period.
The next Common Agricultural Policy will be negotiated within this mandate, and it will apply from 2027. So this is another chance to bring forward the compromises which were found in the structured dialogue for European agriculture. And there were, as I said, quite some good elements about the CAP should be supporting especially small farmers.
After the many flood disasters, farmers were literally up to their necks in water.
The things that we have seen in the last years, droughts, floods and all that, the one issue is farmers' income. Of course, you can always support farmers that have lost everything in a flood or in anything that counts under natural disaster. But obviously, that doesn't mean that you will have the relevant harvest, right? So having a more resilient agricultural system means less intensive agriculture, means more climate resilient agriculture. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with an agriculture that prevents erosion, that improves the capability of the soil to keep healthy in times of drought, that improves also the microbiome of the soil. All these factors have to come together if we want to make our food system more resilient against climate change. And that, of course, are also factors that improve soil health.
Even though there's strong opposition to CAP reform that would include more environmental protection measures, Paulus still hopes that progress will be made in the next few years, especially with regard to soil health. The problems are simply becoming too pressing to sit back and do nothing.
Right, so you always have to have hope, and I would say every centigrade of a degree Celsius which can be avoided of global heating counts. Every animal or plant which is not extinct counts. This is something where I would really say keep optimistic, keep embracing what can be achieved, and don't look too much of what you haven't achieved. look at where you have made a difference, and you might find out that it's not so little after all.
Thanks for listening, and a huge thanks to our guests. If you enjoyed episode 3, please subscribe and leave us a review or a comment. You should also check out the web dossier of the Soil Atlas on our website. Just go to eu.böll.org/en/Soil Atlas. You can find the link and lots more information in the show notes. Our author is Peter Kreisler. Production was done by Monobeat. Our editor was Lena Luig. Narration by Mariana Evenstein and Warner Poland. All the translations were done by Peter Rigney. And our music is by Zoe Keating.